able to see, hug, or speak to her again. It made me wish that I had spent more time with her during the time I had had with her. But I tried to reason that at least she was getting another, younger body somewhere without pain, and that she was happier. We tried to get the church to book us a flight back to the States for her funeral, but they wouldn't get us home in time. My parents, however, were permitted to go to Florida to be at her service. I was devastated that I never got to say goodbye to my grandmother. I sometimes talked to her when nobody was around, just to say goodbye. But I don't think she heard me. Chapter 30. Lower Conditions. 1 week after my grandmother's funeral, Dallas and I were told that we could terminate our assignment in Australia. We boarded a flight home, only to find our room at the flow base had been given to someone else. We had painted, carpeted, and tiled that room on our own dime, but it had been given away. Our new room on the 7th floor had really old, peeling linoleum floors and smelled like mold. There were little piles of sawdust everywhere, and a tiny dresser to serve both of us. The bathtub had clogged and overflowed and hadn't been fixed. The bed must have been at least 25 years old because it creaked when you walked by. In spite of all this, we were happy to be home. As strange and unexpected as our year in Australia had been, it felt good to return to our lives. We knew that it would be difficult to give up some of the freedom that we'd had, but we assumed the adjustment would pass quickly. It didn't. The adjustment was much harder than we'd expected, not just because of what we'd been through abroad, but also because the base itself was worse than it had been. The next day, we had to be at the base by 11 in the morning, and, from the moment we stepped out there, it was clear that things were tighter than they ever had been. We quickly learned that the base's schedule had changed. There was no longer time for personal exercising. Meal breaks had been reduced to 15 minutes. Clean Ship Project, the only time during the week when we got to do our laundry and clean our rooms, had been reduced by 2 hours, and canteen privileges had been canceled, meaning we were not allowed to buy anything from the canteen, including food. The entire base was being punished with lower conditions, and had been for 3 months. This time, it wasn't just me who had a problem with all this. Dallas was quite troubled by it as well. More than was the case before Australia, he and I were on the same page about the church. When we finally got our standard post-mission sec checks, I was a little surprised when Dallas confessed that we had been watching movies and other programs, which was unfortunate. I had decided to offer as little as I could in confessionals, especially in matters the church could not possibly know about, but Dallas's obedience made it futile. During my own sec check, I was asked to estimate how much org money we had wasted by being unproductive and squandering our funds. So I calculated 3 months of rent, plus bus fare and the cost of food. That was just how confessionals worked. If I were to say the org wasted its own money and that we had actually made them $75,000, I would have been asked for more withholds. Bad as things seemed to have gotten on the base, the March 13th annual celebration for L. Ron Hubbard's birthday offered us a clear look at just how bad things really were. For events like this, we were expected to sell new or updated releases of LRH books or Congress lectures to the public using the sales patter, cash or credit. During these sales pushes, we had to make our sales quota, which was always impossible, and this year, the whole crew of 500 people stayed up all night at the shrine, calling around the world to get people to buy the lectures. If we weren't on the phone, we were told to get busy. No food or water was available, and we weren't allowed to get any. Security guarded the door, making sure we didn't leave until 7:30 in the morning. Some people did manage to leave early, like a 70-year-old woman with emphysema, who left at 3 in the morning. However, such people were dealt with harshly at the next day's muster. They were called to the front of the group and reprimanded, told that they were despicable and that their behavior was disgusting. They were put onto a punishment of scrubbing a dumpster, inside and out, for an hour. For the next week, we were warned that if any of us walked one step out of line, the whole group would be put on boot camp, cleaning dumpsters. After the release of the new Congress lecture, each night at 11, the whole base would assemble in the dining area and listen to audio tapes. Each tape was at least an hour long, and was preceded by a lecture on how unethical we all were, and how we had better listen to these lectures so we could learn what Scientology was all about. During the lectures, the supervising staff would walk around, noting who was falling asleep. The next day, their names would be published for all to see. They then would be assigned to dumpster cleaning. It was a constant struggle to keep all my friends in Dallas awake at these tape plays in order to keep out of trouble. Seeing all these people sleep-deprived and exhausted, I found myself thinking of our fundraising experiences in Australia, and the fact that here, just like there, the emphasis seemed to be much more on making money than caring for people or sharing Scientology. In fact, the welfare of the Sea Org members appeared to be the least important thing. To some extent, I'd noticed this before, but Australia helped me to see just how crucial this search for money had become to our duties in the Sea Org. Looking around, I saw that the small realizations we'd had in Australia had a big impact. Suddenly, everywhere around us, we could see not the rules we had to obey, but the freedoms they made us give up. Shortly after we arrived, they began asking via written questionnaire if anyone had a cell phone or had spoken to ex-Sea Org people or had an internet connection that was able to view anti-Scientology websites. At the base, computers were kept in a locked room and key holders required special clearance from OSA. The computers had been loaded with software that blocked known anti-Scientology websites. We were told very clearly that if you failed to report anything, penalties would be high. I revealed that I had a cell phone given to us by Dallas's parents, which we used once per week to call our parents. Before I'd first gotten the phone, I had it approved, but now they told me that the approval was incorrect and I needed to surrender it. Meanwhile, they were also enforcing a slew of new rules. No food or snacks allowed in our desk drawers, even though we were up all hours of the night and had only 15 minutes for meals. No music at our desks. No more civvies 1 day per week. Nobody allowed to go home before midnight. Staff meetings were a long stream of insults and public humiliation for anyone who stepped out of line. Still, I refused to turn over my cell phone. 5 people confided in me that they were not going to give up theirs either, so I figured we could make some sort of stand together. I wound up being the last person on the base who had one. I was told that the newly issued policy banning all cell phones and laptops was because people trying to infiltrate the church could pick up on our cellular waves and listen to our conversations. Thus, it was for our own safety. I argued that this was ridiculous and paranoid. Then the next reason given was that some people looked at pornography on their phones. I told them that was equally ridiculous, and besides, it would be none of their business. Then they gave the reason that they didn't want family members calling with upsetting news. None of it convinced me to give up my phone. All of their excuses were perfect examples of punishment and deprivation for their own sake. They didn't care about the phone itself, and truthfully, by that point, neither did I. I wasn't fighting about a phone. I was fighting about the principle of it. They were trying to take something that belonged to Dallas and me. It was our property, yet they felt entitled to take it. They had already taken away our room, confiscated our television, and removed food from our drawers. What made it even more hypocritical was that by definition one of the main characteristics of a suppressive person was that they had no regard for personal property. It was the kind of object and the kind of argument that made both Dallas and me stop, think about our experience in Australia, and consider just how much we were giving up by living in the Sea Org. If they could take away something as meaningless as a cell phone and treat our belongings like their own, what would happen with the more important things? What about our relationship? They'd already tried to break us apart. Dallas still held out hope that one day they would lift the ban on us having children. What then? We'd learned for ourselves that there was a whole world of people out there who saw flaws with Scientology, and increasingly, we were becoming like them. Maybe the real purpose for taking away our phone was to cut us off from the outside world, to control what information we were exposed to. Not long after we returned from Australia, I was told I couldn't stay in the landlord office. The entire landlord office was moving to the INT base, but since my parents had left the Sea Org, I was not authorized to work there. When I was asked what post I wanted instead, I chose auditor. In retrospect, it was something of an odd decision, but at the time it made a lot of sense. For the last several years, I'd found myself constantly at odds with the Sea Org, their rules and their actions taken toward me. I felt that Scientology was moving away from its mission to help people and becoming more about getting money from the public. Staff members were treated in demeaning ways, despite the fact that they were the ones who had dedicated their lives to the church. A few months earlier, my Uncle Dave had named Tom Cruise, the world's most dedicated Scientologist, despite all the staff and Sea Org members who had sacrificed everything for church. This was exacerbated by having to watch clips of Tom Cruise interviews during our 15-minute meal breaks, where he touted the amazingness of Scientology. Everything was upside down and backward. Nothing was for the greatest good for the greatest number of dynamics anymore. The base was so dreary that I had heard of several people who had seriously considered suicide and been routed out of the Sea Org because of it. However, in spite of all these concerns with how the church was being run, I still, somewhere in the back of my mind, held on to positive feelings about the practice of Scientology itself. In my more frustrated moments, times when I found myself questioning, I was always uplifted when I thought back to all the wins I'd heard over the years and all the ways that Scientology had supposedly helped people. Those memories were the only positive things that I had left in Scientology, and they were all possible because of auditing. Auditing was the embodiment of the only thing in which I still believed. As a result, I decided that if I were an auditor, I could finally be in a position to help people in the most direct way possible. Unlike security checks, during auditing sessions, the auditor was supposed to be nice to people, never becoming angry at the pre-clear. The objective in auditing was to listen and guide, whereas sec checks were much more investigative and uncomfortable. With auditing, not only would I be helping to clear the planet, one person at a time, I'd also be helping people to help themselves. I was excited when my auditor post was approved. I had to do some training before I started and rose through my levels in a couple of months. For the first time in a long time, I enjoyed my studies because they had a purpose. I was taken into auditing sessions for my own advancement. However, I started to notice that the sessions in which I was audited made me feel very anxious. They were too introspective and started to make me feel like I was going crazy. If a session didn't go well, the auditor would assess list after list of what was wrong with me on the session, and it just started making me spin. This was not how auditing was supposed to make me feel. Things only got worse from there. We'd start a session with her asking me if I was upset about anything, and I would burst into tears and start telling her how much the rules and restrictions on the base were just too much. My auditor would then ask me if a withhold had been missed because of my nattering. Her response never failed to frustrate me, and usually I just made up withholds, but after several sessions, I decided I was done accommodating. I was tired of being intimidated. I sat there for an hour saying no, while she grew more and more demanding. "We are going to get to the bottom of this," she warned. I wasn't interested. I stood up to leave, but she blocked me. I tried to push her out of the way, but she kept trying to force me back to the chair. After 2 hours, I threw the cans on the floor and squashed them with my foot. She still wouldn't let me out. She tried to give me 2 more cans, but I smashed them too. I threw my PC folder over the table, causing the papers in it to fly everywhere. She wouldn't let go of my arm or let me out of the room. I pushed her, kicked her, tried to do anything to make her let me go. I was screaming at her, begging her, but she just kept saying, "We are going to get to the bottom of this. What have you done that you can't tell me about?" She wouldn't let me use the restroom. I was sure people outside in the hallway could hear the commotion, but nobody came to see what was going on. After several hours, she told me that we were going to go on a walk. We spent the rest of the day walking and decompressing. The next day, I woke up bruised, exhausted, and very on edge. I was told that as a result of my behavior, I would not be allowed to audit. I was assigned lower conditions. I was told that I had disturbed the sessions of other people in neighboring auditing rooms while trying to get out of my room. This was a suppressive act. I insisted that denying my right to audit was not per policy, but they didn't seem to care. Meanwhile, because I had never given up my phone, people were going to see Dallas several times a day, telling him that he had to give them the phone. He would tell them that it was not up to him and that he wasn't going to battle me for it, but they would harass him nonetheless. Eventually, someone came to me for my phone. When I told him I was not giving it up, he said that he would physically make me. I threatened to call the police. Threatening to call an outside authority for internal issues was so taboo that I would hear about it again. After days of hashing it out with the ethics department, they finally got me to grudgingly agree to amends by paying for the cans, fixing the room, apologizing to my auditor, and apologizing to other auditors. Even then, I was told that I still could not audit. At that moment, I decided I was done with the Sea Org. I had finally gotten to be an auditor only to realize that the rules were not any better for that than they were anywhere else. All at once, everything that had been building for several years, it all just snapped. I wanted to be gone. The first thing I did was run to Dallas's office and tell him how I felt. As I suspected, he was okay with it, and he almost seemed relieved that I was the one who was saying it. But while I was ready to be gone, Dallas wanted to root out properly and cooperate with the church. His method was the only way we could remain in contact with our Scientology family members still in the church and continue to be public Scientologists, paying to take services if and when we wanted. I agreed that I would do this for his sake, and he told me that as long as we did, he would leave with me. In the weeks that followed, several people spoke to me. I was taken into session a few times, and people were trying to work things out so that I would stay. They even decided to move Dallas and me to the PAC base, because we would be allowed to take libs there and have more time off, as things there were slightly more lenient. It didn't work. I just knew that I needed to be out of there. In my secret calls to my parents, they were extremely supportive. They told me that their disillusionment with the Sea Org had progressed in a way similar to mine. They didn't want to go into details, instead choosing to stay vague and cautious, as they knew if they outright attacked the church, it might turn me off to them and the idea of leaving, but told me that I could call them at any time. Over the next week or two, I started speaking with them more regularly. They would tell me about people who had been declared SPs, including my old friend Claire Headley and her husband Mark, both of whom were out of the Sea Org, and now SPs. Teddy Blackman, my brother's friend, was also out. I knew that Mark, Claire, and Teddy were not suppressive people. The declare was ridiculous. With my Aunt Sarah having been recently declared too, I felt that perhaps they were declaring people who they felt they could no longer control, regardless of whether or not they were actually suppressive people. My parents also began to open up more about their experience leaving the church. In the years since they'd left, I'd wondered about their reasons for doing so. Given how committed they once were, I'd assumed that things must have been bad, but I never knew that Uncle Dave had been a part of it. After Mark Headley left, he told my parents that my uncle physically beat staff. Mom said she knew it was true, because she had too witnessed him beating someone, and that had been one of the major turning points that led her to leaving the Sea Org. This was the first time I'd heard something of this nature about Uncle Dave from someone whom I actually trusted. It wasn't so much shocking as it was disturbing. Those in my circles never spoke badly about Uncle Dave, but people were afraid of him. I knew that my uncle had a bad temper, but sometimes in Scientology, a temper meant that you cared. Still, as much as I'd known that people feared him and that he possessed a domineering personality, I hadn't thought him capable of physically harming people. According to my parents, he wasn't afraid to use money to achieve his purposes. My father said that when they left the Sea Org, Uncle Dave offered to pay my mother $100,000 as long as she left and my father stayed. He didn't even make the offer to my mother, he made it to my father, who he must have figured was the more malleable of the two. Of course my father declined, but they were both put off by the gall of my uncle in thinking he could buy people. In the coming weeks and months, I'd learn even more about why my parents left. My mother told me about a girl, Stacy Moxon, who had died a few years earlier. The death was deemed an accident, but the circumstances suggested suicide. Her sister had been inconsolable. I wonder if she knew how depressed and desperate Stacy was. It was so hard hearing stories like this, because the environment of the Sea Org, with all its rules and restrictions, made it impossible not to get depressed and feel hopeless. At the same time, any kind of psychological ills were discounted and ignored, so those in psychological trouble had zero resources. She told other stories about long-married couples, parents of kids I knew at the ranch being forced to divorce because they were married to someone in a lower org. She finished by referencing several people who had been told to make a choice between an abortion or the Sea Org. It was during the course of these phone calls with my parents that my father told me that Uncle Dave had told him that he had personally supervised the Lisa McPherson auditing, instructing that she be attested to the state of clear shortly before her death. All this news served to reaffirm my suspicions. I believed my parents because I felt they had no reason to lie, and that these stories would be hard to make up. The more they told me, the more it confirmed what I already knew or suspected. This type of coercive behavior was widespread. I had been at the Int Ranch, Australia, PAC, and FLAG, and I knew how conditions were and how people were treated. I was glad that I had made my decision. Even Justin, who I hadn't spoken to in a long time, started calling me as well, offering me support if I needed help getting out of there. The pressure to stay came daily. Linda, who was a high-ranking member of OSA, was trying to convince me that I was a valuable asset to the Sea Org, and that I had just hit a few bumps. When I told her about some of the things I'd heard from my parents, her response was simple. People make up lies to suit their own ends. The church also sent friends to convince me to cooperate, but I warned them to stay out of it. I didn't want to ruin these friendships when my beef was with the church, not them. After a few days of one person or another visiting me, I knew I could no longer cooperate. I just wanted out, and Dallas was coming with me. And so, I holed myself up in our room until they decided to give me my leaving security check. Chapter 31. Gone. I spent several days in isolation in my room, waiting for someone in the Office of Special Affairs to give me the necessary materials and sessions to route out properly. Policy dictated that before I could leave, I had to undergo the leaving staff security check. In order to do this, I had to first complete the auditing I'd been in the middle of when this whole mess started. But I physically and emotionally could not do any more auditing, and told Dallas as much. He hadn't told Linda that he was leaving with me yet, as he was waiting for me to start my security check, and hoping to avoid the manual labor that was usually part of the leaving process. That way, he could stay in his post until the very end. Dallas and I argued about my finishing my auditing for several days. He was frustrated that I was being so difficult. He couldn't accept how done I was, no matter how hard I tried to explain it. He wanted more than anything for me to route out properly. Otherwise, he would have to make the choice between me or the church and his family. His family meant everything to him. The only way for him to be with me and still have them was if I weren't an SP. The only way for me to avoid this was to complete my auditing, do my sec check, and sign a few documents. I could sense Dallas was growing more withdrawn, so I tried to give him space. It was a stressful time. He was coming home from work later and later, and was not as excited to see me as he had been. "What's wrong?" I'd ask. "Nothing, just working," he'd say, without much elaboration. I knew something was going on. Dallas always wanted to talk to me, but he wasn't responding to even the simplest questions. I called my parents, who were certain that somebody in the church was talking to him. This had been my first thought as well. However, when I asked him, he said no. Based on their own experience when they had left the church, their words felt right to me. The next time I saw Dallas, I asked point-blank who he had been talking to. He said nobody, and we left it at that, with unspoken questions. We both were being paranoid and suspicious, unsure of how to move forward. Never in our 3-year marriage had we encountered a crossroads like this. One morning, as he was leaving for work, Dallas told me he would be back at lunchtime to visit, but never showed up. Concerned, I pulled out my forbidden cell phone and called reception. No one there knew where he was either. I began to panic that they had him somewhere all over again. I almost couldn't stand the anxiety. Not knowing what else I could do to find him, I lay down and drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, I was awakened by a knock on the door. I opened it to find Linda. I asked her where Dallas was. She said she didn't know, but I could tell she was hiding something by her forced tone. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a small packet of legal-sized papers that were stapled together. "Okay, so this is the checklist for leaving staff," she said. I squirmed at the sound of the words, leaving staff. I knew I was at the end of my rope, but hearing the words out loud was another thing. Never in a million years did I think that I would ever be the one doing the leaving staff checklist. I tried to take comfort in the fact that I had attempted everything I could to make it work. Linda showed me the various steps on the routing form. The first one, as I well knew, was that I was required to receive a staff security check. This gave me the chills all over again. According to LRH, the only reason people left staff was because they had done bad things that they were hiding from others. He believed that taking a confessional and admitting to their actions before they left would actually help them live with themselves, possibly even convince them to stay. This was why the confessional was a requirement to route out properly. If you refused the confessional, you would be declared a suppressive person. Next, Linda explained that the next step on the checklist called for me to sign a bond. She explained that it was a document I would be required to sign, swearing that I would never speak out against the church. If I ever violated this bond, I would have to pay $10,000 for each violation. She said if I didn't sign it, I would be declared an SP. This pissed me off. LRH had never written a policy like this, and I told her as much. One of my main objections to the current management of the Sea Org was just this kind of thing, making up policy that did not originate from the gospel of LRH. Linda got aggravated and told me I was going to sign it. I didn't like her tone or her attitude. I told her I would do my confessional, which I had been waiting to receive for several weeks now, but I would not sign anything. She burst out yelling that I was unethical and being a suppressive person for refusing to sign the bond. She dropped the checklist and bond on the bed and directed me to read it myself. "You mean this?" I said mockingly as I picked it up, shredding it into 100 pieces, and told her to get out of my room. She was not used to people being insubordinate, and shot me a look of disgust before she stormed out, all the while screaming that I was not going to get away with this. I slammed the door, flushed with anger and fear over what I had done, and what might happen as a result. I still hadn't heard from Dallas, and I was getting worried. Finally, at 1:30 in the morning, he walked through the door, looking tired and not particularly happy to see me, which at this hour was a concern. To me, this could only mean he'd been in protracted meetings with church people. I wasn't in the mood to argue, but I did ask him if he was still going to leave with me. "I don't know," he said. If it weren't for all of the awkward silences and mysterious disappearances, I would have been shocked. Still, I couldn't believe that he was about to turn his back on me, let me go through all this by myself, and not even bother to tell me how he really felt until I pulled it out of him. "I just don't know," he continued. "You aren't really cooperating and getting through your confessional like you promised." When he said that, I knew for sure somebody had been feeding him lies. He knew I had been waiting obediently for them to come to me. "You know just as well as I do that I have been sitting here for 2 weeks waiting for them to give me the confessional, and they haven't." "Yes, but that's only because you won't agree to finish your auditing first," he said. "I don't want any more auditing. I just want to get my confessional and get out of here." "Well, if you would just cooperate, then you could," he said stubbornly. "So does this mean that you won't leave with me unless I do the auditing?" I asked. I wasn't prepared for what Dallas said next. "Well, I don't want to leave." "So you are saying that you won't leave with me no matter what?" I asked in total disbelief, trying to get to the heart of the matter. Dallas looked ashamed. My worst fears were confirmed. "Who have you been talking to?" He looked like he had expected this question. "Nobody, I just don't want to leave." "You are lying. Who have you been talking to?" "Nobody, I swear." Looking at him now, I could tell that he was finished with me. He saw me just as Linda did, an uncooperative, rebellious SP. We spent the next few hours arguing, with neither of us giving any ground. All I wanted was to leave and be done with it, and Dallas, for the life of him, couldn't accept why I refused to cooperate. He kept saying that he didn't understand, no matter how many times I explained. He was convinced that I cared less about him and his relationship with his family than I did about my own welfare. He said if I really cared about him, I would do what was being asked of me. I just couldn't bear another auditing session, and church policy was to never audit someone who didn't want to be audited. From my point of view, if he didn't leave with me, then I had endured all this hell for nothing. Finally, at 4 in the morning, our discussion came to an end. The decision had been made. I was going to leave, and he was going to stay. There was no other solution. We were both devastated and crying, but I knew that I would not be able to keep my sanity if I stayed in the Sea Org any longer, and I couldn't argue anymore. I spent the rest of the night packing my bags with his help. As we packed, we both were trying to figure out how we could possibly make this work. We'd said the words that I would leave without him, but neither of our hearts was in it. I wrote a letter to his parents telling them I loved them and to take good care of Dallas. Dallas gave me a couple of his sweaters to remind me of him. In the morning, I called my father, told him what we had decided, and asked if I could live with him and Mom in Virginia. He said he was sorry that things didn't work out, but I could certainly live with them. Dallas had to leave for work, but promised he would be back to drive me to the airport. I felt sick, but determined to carry forward with my plan. I just couldn't continue to live in a place that had to control my every thought and move. Around 8 o'clock that night, Dallas returned home from work. He looked tired and out of it. When we hugged, I saw Linda standing in the door behind him. "What the hell is she doing here?" I demanded. Dallas made her wait by the door while he talked to me. He sat down on the bed and took my hands in his. "Okay, so they're going to let you leave without a confessional," he said. I didn't get why he had said they were letting me, since I was planning on leaving anyway, regardless of whether they were going to allow it. He told me the church had booked me a flight to Virginia for that very night. "Are you coming?" I asked hopefully, even though I knew the answer. "No," he said, looking down to avoid my gaze. There was nothing else I could do. I had tried everything to convince him, but I simply couldn't. It was my biggest failure of all. I burst into tears. I reached for my luggage and asked him if he would at least take me to the airport. He promised me that he would. "Are you ready?" Linda asked from the doorway. Words couldn't express how much I hated her. "Was Dallas with you today?" I asked. When Linda said no and Dallas rolled his eyes, I was sure they had been together. I was furious and started shouting at her. I totally lost it when she tried to convince Dallas to stick me in a cab and not take me to the airport himself. I was his wife, for God's sake. This was going to be the last time we would ever see each other. Yet she was so vindictive she couldn't even let us have that. Dallas finally announced that he was taking me, despite Linda's objections. She was forced to make a few phone calls, but finally permission was granted, on the condition that she accompanied us. I knew the church didn't want Dallas and me to be alone, lest I use my power of persuasion on him. The car ride was tense, with Dallas and I trying to savor our last hours together, and Linda invading our space by parking herself in the middle of the back seat and leaning forward to keep us from getting too close or saying too much. We arrived at LAX 2 hours before my departure. I checked my bags and still had lots of time to be with Dallas to say goodbye. However, Linda was lurking not far away and crowding us, so I told her to back off. I warned her that if she didn't, I would make a scene, knowing that would be bad PR for the church. She reluctantly walked away. Dallas and I had been sitting together in the lounge for only 20 minutes when Linda walked up and told Dallas she needed to get back to work and to leave me there to wait for my flight. I felt Dallas's body tense up. He was visibly frustrated with how little respect this woman was showing for the obvious emotional anguish we were both feeling. Yet somehow he managed to show restraint, a quality I had always admired in him. "Okay," he told her. "Just give us a few more minutes." I just snapped and started screaming at her. Linda hurried off, probably to phone somebody else, but I didn't care. I stood there looking at Dallas, struggling to believe that I would never see him again. I'd wanted out for so long, and yet, standing here listening to Linda disrespect us and our relationship, I knew all at once that there was no way I could get on that plane without him. I knew his heart wasn't in this decision, just as mine wasn't. I couldn't leave Dallas with a group of people like this. The church had an endless supply of Lindas, and when all the dust settled, their wrath toward him would likely be harsh and unforgiving. I refused to let that happen. I was leaving the church, and I was leaving with my husband. I didn't open my mouth about any of this, at least not yet. I told him I'd be right back and went to phone my father to tell him I wouldn't be coming home just yet. Dad understood and said he would be there for me if I needed him. When I got back to the bench, I told Dallas about my change of heart. "I can't leave you," I said. "I don't want to be without you. I will stay and try to fix things." I really had no intention of surrendering to the church, but I wasn't going to tell Dallas that. I just needed the time it would take to convince him to leave with me. Dallas's face lit up, and he pulled me into an enormous hug. As he held me close, I could feel the tension in his body release. "I will do anything you need to help you get through this," he said with pure enthusiasm. I smiled at him, relieved to see how quickly things had changed, even though I still didn't exactly know what I was going to do. As we headed toward the airline office to get my bags, Dallas's cell started to ring. It was Linda, demanding to know where we were. Dallas excitedly told her how he'd convinced me to stay, and we were just going to retrieve my bags. "She can't stay," I heard Linda shout. Dallas was completely blown away. "I thought that we wanted her to stay," he said. "She can't stay," Linda repeated. Dallas was in disbelief. The contradictions of the church were on full display, perhaps more clearly than ever before. He was able to see how the church said one thing and meant another. The fact that I'd agreed to stay should have been a good thing. It meant that I had seen the error of my thinking and was back on board. Wasn't that the goal? Yet Linda was adamant that I was not allowed back. The next thing I knew, Dallas was whisking me outside. He pulled me around a corner to where Linda couldn't hear us. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I have been meeting with Linda and Mr. Rinder the last couple of days. They have been telling me all kinds of horrible things about you and your family. They even told me that if I left with you, I would never see my family again. The only reason they didn't separate us earlier was because I promised not to tell you I was talking to them." My mouth dropped. I knew it. My father had warned me, and I knew myself what the church was capable of, but somehow I didn't understand how they thought they could get away with it. I guess I was just naive. I tried to contain my fury when Dallas told me that they had made him submit to a sec check and prevented him from coming to see me during lunch, and had made him come home late almost every night. They had also locked him up in a boardroom, where Mike Rinder had told him I hadn't been cooperating, I was no good, my parents were evil, and that he should leave me. Dallas looked back at me, waiting for me to say something. It was a scary moment. I was shocked, angry, and relieved all at once. Shocked that the church would go to such lengths to break up a marriage, angry that Dallas had not told me, but ultimately relieved that he was back on my side. He had taken a big risk by even telling me, and I understood and appreciated that. I hoped that I had made the right choice to stay. Linda kept calling us on the cell phone, constantly demanding to know where we were. I was so sick of her harassing us and was so angry at what she had tried to do that I stupidly broke the cell phone when I flipped it all the way back to pick it up. At last, Scientology had finally claimed the cell phone that they'd so desperately wanted. She found us a few minutes later when we were gathering my bags. I was already on edge because of everything I had heard, and now even more so because I had agreed to stay. I suspected that Dallas knew I just wanted time to get him to leave. The hard part was going to be convincing everybody else I wanted to stay and serve the greater good. I wasn't sure how I was going to tolerate being back there, but I'd figure something out. Hopefully this wouldn't take too long. Linda was relentless in trying to separate us as we exited the airport on the way to Dallas's car. She wanted Dallas alone with her so that she could talk to him. I told her to leave us alone or that we were going to call the police. This really freaked her out. She walked away saying that I was creating another scene. Finally, we made it to the parking lot and drove back to the base in Dallas's car. Dallas and I were exhausted and just wanted to go back to our room, but Linda said that was forbidden. "It's not a God-given right to be a Sea Org member," she told us. Instead, she said we had to go to the Blue Building. There, a security officer took us to a room and gave us a list of conditions that would allow me to remain in the Sea Org. Linda stood watch over the whole discussion, frustrated that I had won. As usual, we were told that we each had to do a manual labor program and that we would be separated. By now, Dallas and I were fully cognizant that by separating us, the church was in a much better position to control us. "You've tried separating us," Dallas told the officer. "It just doesn't work. We will do the labor, but we are not separating. You guys are just crazy. We are doing everything you are asking of us, but we are not doing this." I was really happy to have Dallas back on my side. For the first time ever, he was standing up to them, and in his voice, I could hear someone who was approaching his breaking point. The room was getting tense. Someone said that Dallas needed to go into the next room to talk to someone, but that he had to go alone. Dallas refused, until he realized it was easier to hear what they had to say. He told me he'd be right back, and this time I believed him. It was a complete turnaround from just an hour before. When he returned a few minutes later, he told me that they had tried to get him into a car. They wanted to take him to meet with Linda and Mr. Rinder, but he'd resisted. From his tone and the look on his face, I could tell that Dallas's desire to stay was slowly dissolving. As it became clear to them that we were not going to accept their terms and were a united front, they gave an ultimatum: either separate or leave the Sea Org. Dallas told them it was because of them that we were going to be leaving. With that, we said we were going back to our room to get our stuff, but they told us we were no longer allowed on the base. "Well, if you leave, you're blowing," the security officer said. "You'd be leaving without authorization." With this, Dallas flipped a lid. "How can we be blowing?" he said in disbelief. "If you're telling us we can't stay here, how can we be blowing?" I had to try to calm him down, which was kind of weird, since he was always the one trying to calm me down. I told him not to waste his energy on these people. We tried to head to the room, but the security guards blocked us. Frustrated, we went back to Dallas's car. Neither one of us had any money, so we used my dad's credit card, taking him up on his offer to use it if I ever needed to get out. We spent the night at a travel lodge not far from the base, trying to figure out our next move. The following day we went back to the base, only to accomplish nothing. We were both scared and traumatized and not sure if we were doing the right thing. When I made this decision for myself, in a certain way it was easier. Now that I was responsible for Dallas's leaving too, it was much riskier. I could tell that Dallas was frightened. I hoped to God he wouldn't switch sides again. The next morning there was a knock on our door. I couldn't imagine who it was since nobody knew we were staying there. It was the security officer, dressed in a business suit, not his uniform. He handed us an envelope and pointed to a U-Haul in the parking lot. Inside the envelope were pictures of all of our belongings, with corresponding numbers to indicate which box they were in. All the boxes had been methodically packed in the U-Haul. There was a corresponding list of everything we owned, down to the number of pennies and Q-tips we had. The officer walked us to the parking lot, while another security guard circled us on a bicycle. "Just so you know where you stand, you guys are blowing, and that is suppressive," he told us. Pointing his finger in Dallas's face, he warned, "I am going to do everything in my power to make sure you never talk to your family again." I didn't know what the church planned to do to make good on its threat, but hearing this made me very uneasy and infuriated Dallas. That morning we set off for Dallas's parents' house in San Diego. He had called them already and they were expecting us. Each mile that we put between us and the base made us feel safer, as though we could feel the ropes that had bound us there breaking one by one. No longer would we have to wear uniforms. We could determine our own wake-up times or decide to go see a movie. We could earn our own way in the world and make our own rules. It would truly be the greatest good for the greatest number of dynamics. Only now, for the first time in our lives, the math worked in our favor. Chapter 32. The Real World. Dallas's parents greeted us warmly when we arrived. They were glad to have Dallas home with them, but had mixed feelings about his leaving the Sea Org. They were worried about what it would mean for their future in Scientology, as well as the ramifications for his siblings and their families. I was grateful that they took us in, but it was going to be a minefield negotiating it all. Everybody had his own vested interest in how they wanted us to behave when it came to the church. While I wanted to keep them happy, my main concern was being in a marriage with Dallas in which only the two of us made the decisions. Dallas's parents said we could stay with them, and that they would give us jobs at the jewelry store, which was Scientology-friendly. All new employees were required to do an introductory course in Scientology, whether they were Scientologists or not. Despite hiring many public Scientologists, Dallas's dad had told himself that he'd never hire ex-Sea Org members again, because it usually meant trouble, but that he'd make an exception for us. When we reported for work our first day, I was terrified. I was given a job in the Human Resources Department. Even though I was shy, I found the people to be extremely welcoming. They were friendly, honest, caring, and supportive, more so than anyone I had ever encountered in the church. The one uncomfortable thing about the job was applying Scientology to problems that came up. I was trying to distance myself from Scientology. I still believed in it, but I needed a break from it and didn't like subjecting non-Scientologists to the techniques. Adjusting to life outside the church was a lot more of a process for me than it was for Dallas. I didn't have a driver's license and was not used to talking to wogs. I also had nightmares every night. I was either being chased by people in the church trying to get me to come back, or they were trying to convince Dallas to return and that I had to save him. We'd been in San Diego only a few days when Linda began calling Dallas's father, asking him to find out where we stood with the church and what our plans were. This created a lot of tension between Dallas's parents and us. They were trying to get us to sort things out with the church, and since we lived and worked with them, we couldn't catch a break or have any privacy. At one point, they even traveled to Los Angeles to meet with Linda, and she showed them our negative reports. I didn't like the underhanded way the church was using Dallas's parents. First, they wanted to be sure that we weren't going to make trouble for them now that we were out of the Sea Org. Second, which was worse, they were using an audience with his parents as a way to point out what a bad influence I had been on their son. They were sharing records about when his behavior had started to turn, and highlighted how it coincided with his befriending me. In spite of all this, Dallas and I enjoyed our freedom outside the church. Once we started making some money, we were able to get our own place, a condo in central San Diego. We even got 2 dogs. We were able to visit my parents in Virginia, where we also saw Justin and Sterling, who was now also out of the Sea Org. At my job, I often talked to people who were curious about the church. They would ask me questions about growing up there and would be utterly horrified by my responses. They would tell me that these things weren't normal, and even offered their support. Through their eyes, I slowly learned how weird my upbringing had been. We'd been out of the church less than a year when Dallas and I received a summons for a committee of evidence to establish our standing in the church. In a com-ev, your actions are put on trial, and 4 people sit in judgment, deciding if you are guilty of the crimes against the church that are listed. I wanted to return the summons to them with my dog's poop in the envelope, but Dallas's dad convinced Dallas to go sort things out. His parents wanted the security of knowing that he was in good standing with the church, and that neither he nor I would be declared SPs. It took a lot of convincing, but in the end I agreed to do the committee of evidence to appease them, knowing it was going to be excruciatingly hard and humiliating. The church was charging me with 5 crimes and 4 high crimes, citing various incidents that had occurred in August 2005 and some as far back as October 2003. My high crimes included failing to apply the Scientology technologies I had been taught to difficulties I encountered in my life, threatening to call police in the weeks prior to my leaving the Sea Org, refusing to follow standard procedure for routing out of the Sea Org, and telling Dallas that I intended to leave, which was considered a suppressive act. I had also damaged the auditing room and cans when I tried to leave my auditing session, engaged in an altercation with Linda at the airport, and disagreed with and yelled at my superiors at various times while on post, all considered crimes against the church. Dallas was also facing a number of crimes and high crimes, but the majority of them had to do with his failure to handle me when I violated the standards for leaving staff by refusing to do my auditing, and when I threatened to call police. He was also being cited for his failure to handle me when I blew up at others upon our return to the base from the airport after I had changed my mind about leaving the Sea Org. After finally being out, the last thing I wanted to do was hear a bunch of nonsensical evidence against me, or worse, for the church to feel like it had the power to summon me at will. It was an extremely hard pill for me to swallow, but I decided to do it for Dallas, because it could clear up our standing in the church. He was still holding out hope that he could have a relationship with the church, which would make life a lot easier for his entire family. We all drove up to the PAC base in LA one morning. I knew the entire proceeding was going to be recorded, so I told them that I was also going to be recording it as well, and put my tape player on the table. Dallas and I were going to have our committees of evidence individually, and I was going first. In the proceeding, I was told the various charges against me and was asked if I pleaded guilty or not guilty. I said not guilty to all of them. I told them that I didn't agree with anything that happened and that it was their doing. When they asked me if I was going to take responsibility for anything, I said no. They asked me if I would be willing to route out of the Sea Org in the standard fashion, if it meant being able to continue to speak to Dallas's family. I told them that I would think about it. Dallas went next. He also pleaded not guilty to most of the charges, but not all of them. On the one he did plead guilty for, however, he told them it was their own doing. For the next few weeks, we waited for our findings and recommendations. 4 months passed before they finally arrived. In the findings, I was found guilty of mayhem, mutiny, and telling Dallas that I wanted to leave staff. The committee had recommended that we be declared SPs. However, the International Justice Chief intervened, saying if we wanted to return to good standing with the church, we just needed to do 250 hours of amends each, get through a security check, pay our freeloader bill, and do lower conditions. The findings were severe and didn't even attempt to acknowledge an injustice. They were more severe than Dallas and his parents had expected, but for my part, it was what I expected. Not surprisingly, I had no intention of following through with any of their measures. The whole decision felt like it played out too conveniently in the church's favor, but at least for now, Dallas's parents would not be made to disconnect from us. Being out allowed us to gain more of an outsider's perspective on the church. It didn't come to us all at once in the form of one big piece of information from one source. More frequently, we learned little things here and there, but over time they added up. My father sent Dallas and me some online posts written by someone using the screen name Blown for Good. They illustrated just how bad things had gotten on the int base and told stories of physical abuse, sleep deprivation, separating people from their spouses, all of which had supposedly been orchestrated by my uncle. In many ways, these stories paralleled other things I'd heard from my family members who'd left. Blown for Good was also posting on the Operation Clambake website, so I'd been reading his entries. There was a link to a South Park episode that satirized Scientology, which I had heard a lot of talk about. It spoofed the highest levels in the church, the OT levels that existed beyond the state of clear. Specifically, its target was OT Level 3, Wall of Fire, which disclosed LRH's theory of evolution. This was many levels higher on the bridge than anything Dallas and I had encountered, and we debated back and forth about whether we should watch it. We had always been told that acquiring this information prematurely could result in serious personal and mental injury. I knew it was ridiculous, but honestly, I was a little scared. I might have been out of the Sea Org, but this was something I had been told my entire life. Even though I was out of the church, I still had that built-in hesitation. I knew it was irrational. Obviously, tons of people watched the South Park episode, and they were still alive. So Dallas and I decided to take our chances. The episode was amusing and a little ridiculous. It was like science fiction. We already believed that we were Thetans, so I had expected that LRH's theory of evolution would involve other planets. However, the details of a galactic overlord and a planet named Xenu were new to us. We learned that OT3 claimed that 75 million years ago, a galactic overlord named Xenu banished Thetans to Earth to solve an overpopulation problem on his alien planet. The banishment of the Thetans, and a series of incidents surrounding it, were said to be the source of all human misery. This was not known to many Scientologists, as they would only have known about it if they had made it that far up the bridge. Because of its far-fetched conceit, OT Level 3 is often cited by Scientology skeptics looking to demonstrate the absurdity of the religion. Learning about OT3 was eye-opening, both in terms of the fact that Scientologists actually believed that, but also because of what it told me about my own skepticism about the church. While it was hard to fathom that the highest levels of the church were focused on what felt a lot like a science fiction story, what struck me the most was not the story itself, but the fact that if I had heard this at the peak of my faith, I probably would have believed it. As an outsider now, I could plainly see that it raised serious questions. However, it was only because I'd left that I was able to see it for what it was, a web of stories that seemed to have little basis in reality. Once we learned about OT Level 3, more than ever before, Dallas and I began to feel that this whole thing had been made up, and that LRH had just kept going and going with his stories, making it up as he went along. OT Level 3 didn't feel like belief. It felt like fiction. In the aftermath of learning about the OT levels, I found myself thinking of all the public Scientologists I'd encountered while we were fundraising in Australia, and how much time and money they would have had to invest to get to OT Level 3. I found myself thinking about what it would feel like for them to finally have that truth revealed, and how natural their skepticism would be, but how hard it would be to embrace that skepticism knowing that you devoted such a big part of your life to it. A person who was a public Scientologist would have already invested thousands of hours and paid in the range of $100,000 to be at OT Level 3. By then, she would be pretty deeply invested both financially and socially. She would have already turned all of her friends and family to Scientology and would have garnered a lot of respect for accomplishing so much. Thus, it would be hard to not embrace the reveal. This is to say nothing of how Sea Org members like my parents and grandparents, who would have invested not just money but years and decades of their lives, would react to the revelations in this level. In part, because of all this, but also because of our own curiosity, Dallas and I were both becoming more interested in seeing what people outside the church thought of it. Dallas started reading The Bare-Faced Messiah, The True Story of L. Ron Hubbard, by Russell Miller, a British journalist. The book was an eye-opener for Dallas. I read parts of it too and began to see what a fraud LRH had been. Even if only half of what I was reading was true, it meant that he had lied about nearly every one of his accomplishments. I had often wondered how he could have done all the things that he had purported to have done, and now I was seeing that he likely never actually had. For both Dallas and me, this book exposed the founder of Scientology as a power-hungry, egomaniacal, crazy, and charismatic liar. It forced me to examine my thoughts and feelings about Scientology. Did I really agree with its policies and its teachings? Had I ever experienced any of its powers? Bit by bit, I started questioning everything I had ever been taught. I had always believed that I was a Thetan, and that one day I would be able to come out of my body. I had no real evidence of that, as it had never happened to me. I also wasn't convinced about millions of years of past lives or the recollections of them, and wondered if they were nothing more than my subconscious, not true experiences from the past. I also questioned whether Scientology's organizational methods, such as whether knowledge reports, really worked. We used them at the jewelry store, and I had started to doubt their effectiveness. In my opinion, the Big Brother concept of internal policing made people more paranoid than productive, and alienated people from each other. My biggest question with Scientology came from the overts. Growing up in the church, I had never realized outright the importance of my own individuality and how valuable it was. Anytime you had an individual thought or opinion that was contrary to Scientology teaching, you were told you had an overt, or a misunderstood word. I was now realizing this was just to stop you from challenging them on any level. It was nothing but complete suppression of free thought. Now that I was no longer in the church, I bristled when I felt they still had influence over even my minor personal choices. On MySpace, I was being pressured to unfriend SPs like Mark and Claire Headley and Teddy Blackman. Claire had been a good friend in the church, and I wanted to stay in touch with her. Not only did I refuse to block them, I also put up a post stating that I wouldn't do it. These people were my friends, and if anybody had a problem with it, then too bad. Slowly, all of my friends in Scientology began unfriending me, including many of those who had said they didn't care that I was no longer a Scientologist. Many of them contacted me and told me that they had been told by people in the Office of Special Affairs that they must delete me as their friend or they would no longer be able to speak to their families. After that, Dallas and I joined the online communities for ex-Scientologists, using different names. We got a chance to read people's stories and tell our own. They were eerily similar. We had all gone through hell. I was particularly surprised to hear that many of them had experienced recurring nightmares, just as I did. The sense of community I felt with other former members was growing. In January 2008, Tom Cruise, an unauthorized biography by Andrew Morton, was published. The pre-publicity was huge, and sure enough, the book was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list within 3 days of its release. Dallas and I didn't know much about Tom Cruise's life, but we did know he was the most famous celebrity associated with Scientology. We both read the book with great curiosity and found that it contained many factual accounts of the RPF, family disconnection, and other Scientology practices. The release of this book and the publicity surrounding it highlighted many of Scientology's abuses. Dallas and I thought that it was great this information was getting out to hundreds of thousands of people. Of course, the church was all over it and immediately went into damage control mode, denouncing just about everything that had been written. In a 15-page rebuttal, it called the book a bigoted, defamatory assault replete with lies, and went on to list each and every allegation and provided a response. Their outright denial of a family disconnection policy elicited outrage in me. Does Scientology encourage their members not to speak to their family if they don't know the religion? The release asked. This is not only false, it is the opposite of what the church believes and practices. Suddenly I felt an overwhelming need to do something. Their outright lies felt like a spit in the face of everyone who had gone through hell on their behalf. It also showed that they wouldn't be changing anytime soon. With a nudge from Dallas, who, like me, was frustrated by the church's continued pressure on our relationship with his parents, I wrote a letter to Karen Powell, the spokesperson for the church and author of the rebuttal. I cited dozens of examples of forced disconnection in my family and in others. I ended the letter with a personal challenge. If I am in fact wrong, and you want to prove me as such, then allow me and my family to be in contact with our family members who are still part of the church, such as my grandpa, Ron Miscavige, and his wife, Becky. Allow the same for my friends. I told her there were too many destroyed families for the church to be able to get away with denying it any longer. I suggested that she spend less time writing rebuttals and more time repairing the families destroyed by the church, starting with the family of David Miscavige himself. If Scientology can't keep his family together, I wrote, then why on earth should anyone believe the church helps bring families together? Looking back at my letter now, I wish I had been a bit clearer and a little less angry. Nonetheless, I had taken a stand and shared my letter with a few friends who forwarded it to the media, who made it public. Immediately, I received an outpouring of support from all kinds of people, ex-Scientologists, people who had had encounters with Scientology, ex-members of other cults, and regular people. It was amazing as well as eye-opening to hear from so many people with similar stories. This wasn't about a few isolated incidents, as the church liked to make it seem. This was systemic, and it was widespread, and the world needed to be told. Chapter 33. Sharing the Truth. With the publication of my letter to Karen Powell, my desire to advocate for victims of the church was sparked. In the months to come, I found myself speaking out in the media and participating in my first organized protest against the church. It all started with a video of Tom Cruise that went viral on the internet. In it, he was discussing LRH's famous Keep Scientology Working discourse, in all Scientology speak. He was saying absurd things, such as Scientologists driving by an auto accident were the only ones who could help the injured people. He made all sorts of egotistical comments interspersed with his maniacal laughter, ending with his awkward salute to my uncle. I heard people talking about it everywhere I went. Right away, the church went into damage control mode and tried to keep the video off the internet by sending threatening cease and desist letters to the owner of the website hosting the video. This was a common tactic used by the church to use copyright law to sue people. But this time, it didn't work. On January 21st, shortly after the video aired, a group of hackers, activists who called themselves Anonymous, posted a video to the church on YouTube, telling them that in response to their censorship, they were going to expel them from the internet. And they did. They managed to bring down their servers for 3 days. Almost immediately,